What if we told you that scientists were able to reconstruct the face of one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs for the first time in 3,200 years? With some of the most advanced imaging software, researchers from England and Egypt used this technology to produce 3D images of the skull and came up with what they believe Ramses II might have looked like when he died over 3,200 years ago at the age of 96. The artists, however, used the software to turn back the clock even further to produce an image of Ramses II during his early 40s. Today, we live in the era of artificial intelligence where anything could be created in less than a few seconds using your smartphone. With that kind of superpower, what is stopping us from uncovering the mysteries surrounding the mummified bodies of the pharaohs? The mighty pharaoh of the past might have never thought that his face would one day be recreated by computers in the future. Well, that's exactly what scientists from Egypt and Europe did, so keep watching till the end to know what new technology scientists use to help us see what the pharaohs might have actually looked like. Modern technology has helped us a lot when it comes to understanding what our past looked like, all the way from DNA tests to satellite imagery. This way, both scholars and non-scholars can explore what life looked like for our ancestors and how their contributions changed the world around us. Today, we could use the same technology to understand and relate to our past heritage. We already have several initiatives that use facial recognition technology to reconstruct the faces of people from history. It all started with colorization of old photographs. Later, researchers realized that there is a way to travel further back in time, especially to a time where photography was not even invented. This way, we are finally able to bridge the gap between our written ancient past and the present. Today, we have the technology to recreate the facial structures of several historic figures, all thanks to the efforts of forensic scientists, graphic artists, and archaeologists. This way, we gain a better understanding of individuals and what they look like in their respective era. When it comes to the pharaohs, it is their mummification methods that gave us several clues as to what their faces might have looked like using all the skeletons and masks. So those ancient pharaohs are now coming back to the present day, all thanks to technology that we have today. Skulls from the mummified bodies are known to provide clues to personal appearance, and several detailed measurements of an old skull will provide basic information that is needed to determine the sex, stage of life, and the ethnic origin of the deceased. With the general information like the thickness and type of tissue, a forensic sculptor can create the likeness of that individual, covering the skull at various points. But with the technology that we have today, all of this could be done digitally. When it comes to a traditional facial reconstruction, a sculptor who is familiar with facial anatomy works with a forensic anthropologist to interpret skeletal features that reveal subjects' age, ancestry, and sex, along with anatomical features like facial asymmetry. Evidence of injuries, for example, like a broken nose or loss of teeth, usually indicate the depth of tissue to be added to the skull. This depth is determined from the studies over the past century of males and females of different ancestral groups. Strips of clay are applied, and that's when artists begin to rebuild the face by filling in around the markers, followed by refining facial features around the artificial eyes. Then on the lips, and finally, facial contours are smoothed out and subtle details are added accurately to personalize the reconstruction. The finished product, however, only approximates the actual appearance because the cranium simply does not reflect soft tissue details like hair, skin color, eye, facial hair, shape of lips, or the fat tissue that covers the bone. But it could still help with putting a name on an identified skull in the case of modern forensic cases or an archaeological investigation like a face on history. Both forensic science and archaeology use forensic facial reconstruction. This technique is used in forensic science to identify a person when more traditional methods of identification prove ineffective. It is used in archaeology to identify the faces of historical figures with bone fragments and embalmed bodies. But in today's day and age, bringing back pharaohs with this technique might not be the best way to do it, especially when people are able to create AI art with just their phones. That's why the mighty Egyptian king Ramses II is now making headlines, because we are finally able to see what he looks like. For those of you who don't know about Ramses II, he was the third king of the 19th dynasty of ancient Egypt, who was known for having the second longest reign in Egyptian history. He lived up to 96 years old, and he is known to have more than 200 wives and concubines, 96 sons, and 60 daughters, most of whom he outlived. He's also regarded as the greatest, most celebrated, and most powerful fellow of the New Kingdom, which later turned out to be the most powerful period of ancient Egypt. The 66-year reign of Ramses II marked the last peak of Egypt's imperial power. The pharaoh was then buried in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, but his body was later moved to a royal cache where it was discovered in 1881. Now back to the present. For the first time ever, historians were able to see what Ramses II might have looked like at various points in his life, all thanks to several collaborative scientific projects. Yes, Ramses II is that same pharaoh who was responsible for enslaving the Jews in the Book of Exodus. The reverse aging process was done by the UK-based Liverpool John Moores University Face Lab. Scientists from both Egypt and England collaborated to capture the king's likeness at the time of his death using a 3D model of the scale to rebuild his features. The visual artist created a 3D virtual model of the pharaoh's head and skull from a CT scan, which took thousands of X-rays and created an image using all of them. Researchers in Liverpool then used the results of the 3D image to reconstruct his features, with the software that's frequently used to identify people of interest in criminal investigation. They were then able to distinguish between the skull and other embalming materials and finally created a rendering of the skull, at least what they believe is an accurate image of the face of the Egyptian king. The average facial muscle layer measurements thought to be appropriate for ancient Egyptians were used to reconstruct this powerful pharaoh's face. 3D visualizers used the 3D model of Ramses' skull to rebuild his features. They then turned back the clock to reveal his face during his prime days of power. Recreating a face from the past is quite a challenging task because different populations and ethnicities have different average measurements in various regions of the face, including the slant on the forehead, the nasal, malar, and labial regions. The best way to get this right would be to use the measurements from a population that is as close to the region as possible, and that's exactly what the researchers did. The software identified the properties of several layers of skin and tissue in the mummy's face along with little bandages and worked on digital unwrapping of the pharaoh's face. The visualization of fine features such as ear piercing were also made possible by modern image reconstruction software. The mummified remains of the pharaoh were discovered back in 1881 near the southern Egyptian city of Luxor. Today, the mummy of this pharaoh can be found at the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo, Egypt. The remains were partially unwrapped to be examined by researchers, because of which facial reconstruction using digital technology was possible. So to sum things up, we finally got to see what Ramses looks like, all thanks to a new facial rendering software combined with a software that is used to identify criminals and victims in the UK for a project. You might already know about CGI or computer-generated imagery, and that's exactly what researchers used to visualize skin and hair. Based on common features of others in the region during that time, researchers were able to create a very realistic image of how he would have looked like. They also used facial approximation to create a potential head shape based on several series of other scrolls that were discovered from that time, and yet we are still not sure whether Ramses II was the pharaoh who prosecuted Moses and the Israelites, because it is not mentioned in the Bible or any other Abrahamic religions. But historians believe it has to be Ramses II because he was a celebrated ruler during the peak of Egyptian power in the 13th century BCE. He is known for his extensive building programs and for several colossal statues of him found all over Egypt. Whatever it is interesting to shed some light on what some of these historical figures looked like from their remains that the Egyptians were smart enough to preserve.